Well, good evening. Today's the day we remember the price that Jesus paid during his crucifixion. And it's often said that Jesus paid the heaviest price for his faith out of anyone. And I remember growing up and hearing some of the stories of people in the past, martyrs that faced horrible difficulty and torture and brutal just treatment because of their faith in Christ. And I'd often wonder, how do we know that Jesus paid the heaviest price? Like, did he really? Do we know that? Do we really know? I mean, we're not going to repeat the stories, but many people in history, I remember, paid a heavy price for their faith. Did Jesus really pay the heaviest price? And so today's the day we look at that. And I'm going to look at key aspects of his suffering. If you think that anyone paid as heavy of a price for their faith as Jesus did, you don't understand the full aspect of what he went through and what he endured. And so I'm going to talk about three key aspects of his suffering. Some of what we know and much of what isn't talked about today, very much at least during this time. The first one was his physical suffering. And this is the one most talked about. This is the one we focus on a lot. And for obviously good reason. He suffered heavily. If you've ever watched the movie The Passion of the Christ, it gives you an idea of what kind of suffering he went through, at least an idea of it. Jesus was strapped to a block while soldiers would whip him with a nine-tailed whip. So there were these shards on the end of these whips that they would put into his body, and they would stick in his body because they're very sharp, and then they'd rip it out, and his flesh would come out many times just to have them do it again and again and again. He was beaten mercilessly, probably to near death at that point. And again, we hear of that. A crown of thorns was placed on his head. So this isn't just something that was sat there. These thorns they had at that time were huge thorns, and they pressed it down on his skull, and it even penetrated into his skull, where the blood would come down, run into his eyes and burn. He could hardly see. That's what those were the types of things that he endured back then. And then obviously we know he carried a wooden beam, carried his cross. He was made to carry it himself. It was a wooden splintered beam that probably dug into him as well, that he had to carry, and he was obviously exhausted, and he fell, and he had to carry it to the cross to where they crucified him, and then obviously those nails. Again, there's a lot more that you could say on that. You could have a whole sermon just on his physical suffering. It's hard to put in, it's even hard to put in a movie, like if you see The Passion. There's more to it than that. You almost have to read it to see what was happening to his body. It's hard to even get into. I won't repeat it here. It is the one that we focus on the most. But of the three that I'm going to mention tonight, the three aspects, I believe it was the least difficult for him to endure, was the physical suffering that he endured on the cross. The next one I'm going to mention is the fact that his disciples abandoned him. His disciples abandoned him. In Matthew 26:31, he said, after he had the Last Supper with them, communion, washed their feet, Jesus said to his disciples, this very night you will all fall away on account of me. We focus a lot on Judas, and we focus on Peter disowning him, and this is the place where Peter disowned, or said he'd never disown him. We focus on those two, but in actuality, they all betrayed him at his crucifixion. They weren't there for him. Only John watched, but more from a distance as an observer, not as a companion walking with him through this. They left him alone to endure this. Okay. Now, I want you to think of this a little. I know when I've helped lead communion in the past, I've mentioned this too, is Imagine, we're going to have communion here tonight. Imagine that you knew this coming week you would face the most difficult trial you would ever endure. And also, imagine if you knew that everybody in this room was going to turn their back on you and betray you. At that point, how much would you feel like doing communion with us? At that point. This is what Jesus did. He taught them one of the most important sacraments at the Last Supper. He washed their feet. He spent 3 years of his life just pouring out everything he could teach to these disciples of his. He loved them. He did everything with them. He taught them all the way up. And right after their most intimate moment they probably had with him, they all betrayed him. Now, this would be tough for anyone to have to face, but Jesus, I think it was uniquely difficult. After all, if you're a kind of a person with rough edges, you maybe don't love people that well, somebody betrays you, it doesn't hurt as much because you've built a few walls that it's not going to bother you. But if you love somebody deeply and they betray you, that gets tougher. And the more deeply you love, the more difficult it is. Jesus loved perfectly, purely, agape love, fully, put his life into all these disciples of his, and every one of them leaves him go. And they were all like, no, we'll never betray you, Jesus. They all said that. And then within a short time, every one of them did. It may not, depending who you are, it might not be. For Jesus, this I believe, was more difficult for him to endure than his physical suffering. The fact that these disciples left him in his hour of need. The one time he needed disciples is the one time they weren't there for him. And more difficult than his physical suffering that he endured. But not the most difficult. The third aspect, I believe, was the most difficult for him to endure. And that's that Jesus was separated from his Father. In Matthew 27:45, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, there's some that'll teach that Jesus really wasn't forsaken, that he just felt forsaken. There's some that say that. To that, I would say, well, then what else did Jesus say in the Gospels that we can't trust? Number one. And number two, even more important, the whole purpose of what Jesus did on that cross was to pay the price for our sin. What is the key aspect of a punishment for my sin? Among anything else you want to say it is, we know that it's this, separation from God. That's the punishment for my sin. Separation from God. It may be a host of other things, but we know the fundamental aspect is separation from God. Jesus had to endure that separation to pay the full price for my sin. He had to endure the separation from his Father in heaven. That's why he cried out. That's why he did that. And Jesus, remember, this was an eternal relationship. The Father and the Son were always together. It was always there. And at the one moment when he needed his Father's love more than ever, when he needed the Father to wrap his arms around him, was the one moment that the Father had to turn his back and let him suffer alone. Which brings up another aspect that we don't really talk about a whole lot on Good Friday, and that's the suffering of the Father. We don't really talk about that during this whole thing, is the suffering that the Father had to endure. Imagine you as a parent, for those of you that are parents, you have this child, lives a perfect life, does nothing wrong. And you've always had, and with the Father and the Son, this was an eternal relationship that the Father and the Son had. And then this son of his has to endure at the hands of evil people a suffering beyond imagination, a physical suffering for doing nothing wrong. And he faced the abandonment of all his disciples. And the Father had to watch all this happen. He actually had to set up the scene to allow this to happen. He had to grow the tree that Jesus hung from. He had to create, Satan was behind it, but the Father had to allow this scenario to happen. And at the one moment when the Father would have loved to be there for his Son in all of history was the one moment that the Father had to turn his back to his Son and allow him to suffer alone. Could you do that as a parent? He did that for us. He allowed his Son to suffer so that he could restore the relationship with us. Who really paid the heaviest price on Good Friday? Was it the Son or was it the Father? It's a question worth asking, I believe. So I believe that this was the most difficult thing for Jesus to endure. And that's something none of us have had to endure. We've never had this perfect eternal relationship. Our relationships are more broken. But the Father and the Son had a perfect relationship. And at this moment, Jesus had to do this alone so that the price for us could be paid. And this, I believe, was the most difficult for him to face. Because when Jesus was on that cross, he didn't cry out, my God, why do I have to face all this physical suffering and this crowd jeering at me? He didn't cry that out. He didn't cry out, my God, why have my closest companions abandoned me? He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? At his moment right before death, right before he says it is finished and gave up his spirit, at that moment, you're not thinking about little things anymore. It's the most difficult, the most hard thing that you have to endure. And at that moment, he cried out for his Father. He says, why have you, even Jesus, who had the answer for like everything. People come to him for answers all the time. And he always had a thought-provoking answer. He always had a thought-provoking answer. He knew so much. But this is one time when he cried out why to his Father. It was that difficult for him to endure. As Jesus' blood spilled on the earth, as he endured this physical suffering, as he endured the betrayal of his closest companions, and as he endured the separation from his Father, my sin was justly punished.